Cool. I'm very happy to have as our last speaker of today, Raksha Muthukumar here. Raksha Muthukumar lives in New York and is therefore remote, and she played quite a role in the unionization of Google. So after talking about academia and what we can do in the academic field, after talking about more street climate activism in the sense of Extinction Rebellion and the like, we are now looking into unionization and activism in big corporations. Raksha, I'm very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking mostly about the Google Union project, and then I'm also going to be giving an update kind of on what I see as like the major pressing issues in the tech labor movement, and also some updates on the kind of activism I've been doing since I've left the Google Union, essentially. So I'm gonna take us through like a timeline of how the union began and kind of what that project really looked like. Then after that, it's gonna be like a little bit more of a talk around the like legal and community formalities around union development, as well as a little bit of like group discussion and maybe some reflection on how we all might like participate in conversations or community organizing stuff like this, whether it's in our workplace or in our universities, things like that. Okay, yeah, to start off with, I was one of the founding members of the Google Union. I was also a spokesperson for the union. So for those couple of years, kind of pre-launch of the union publicly, as well as immediately post our launch for it, I was doing most of our press work and our like public image. And my day job was that I was a software engineer at Google. I worked on just like Google search and kind of the tools that journalists and stuff use to publish their work around Google search. So that was what I was doing in the day. And then other than that, I was really like focused on organizing with my coworkers and then like meeting people around the giant corporation that is Google, because it's such a massive company. It's like 100,000 people all around the globe. So it was a pretty large undertaking to start talking about what like a formal union project, especially in the United States, might look like, because we didn't at that time, and even now, we really don't have a lot of infrastructure for what it looks like to unionize at like white collar jobs, like in the tech industry, or you know, other things that are considered like higher paying jobs. We don't really see them as union jobs, and there's a lot of pushback against like what might someone in a good job even want a union for? What does it mean to democratize a workplace? So when we started this project, we didn't really have a lot of roadmaps for it. We were one of the first tech companies to really launch a major union campaign like this. There was a couple other smaller ones, like 6-7 person startup tech companies that were doing it, but we were really the first ones to do it at like scale in this way. So we were kind of inventing the roadmap as we were doing it, which was interesting. And just for context, we were kind of not the only ones doing it at that time, and we haven't been the only ones since then. Lots of tech companies have started having just like a larger activism and employee organizing culture. There's a lot more concerns, I think, these days about kind of workplace cultures, people's rights, what kind of negotiating power we have when we come into work, things like that. So it's a bit more of an ongoing conversation than I feel like it even was like 6 years ago or so, which is when I first started like, you know, job hunting and joining the tech industry. The conversation of being in a unionized tech company was really not like a question. And now it is. Now, like, you really can look for jobs that are like a union position. So as a timeline, and just to kind of give context on why we began this project at all. Why did we like decide to unionize at Google? Why did we decide to do it at that moment? So kind of a summary of the union and like kind of the mission statement is that the Alphabet Workers Union is a result of a lengthy struggle between activist employees and Alphabet leadership over how conflicts within the company are resolved and how Google's powerful technology is deployed. So that's kind of the like stated mission statement. And for folks who aren't familiar, I mean, I think you guys are all familiar probably, but Alphabet is the parent company of Google and YouTube and kind of all those subsidiaries. So one of the major Spark issues in 2018, I guess for like activist employees slash just like people who worked at Google who cared about our global impact, right? All of us engineers or project managers or like anybody who worked in the company who was really had concerns about like the direction the company was going and if it was ethical. A real spark moment was in 2018 with Project Maven and Project Dragonfly, which were the kind of in-house like code names for AI projects that would either have given us weaponized drones or government censorship. And those were two really hot button topics at that time. Like really, people really like spoke out. People really like put their jobs on the line for kind of like a like first major moment where people really publicly came out and said that they don't agree with what their employer is doing and that like Google should not be doing this, essentially. So these were two projects that really sparked some conversation. After that, kind of in close sequence in the same year, 2018, we saw Andy Rubin, who was the creator of Android and a former Google executive. He was paid 90 million as an exit package for leaving Google. And this was like a really kind of upsetting and like controversial moment because while he was getting paid out, almost all the women who like spoke up and reported against him were like pushed out and not given $90 million, as you might imagine. And it was like a pretty, you know, it was like a very formally substantiated and public situation. Like everybody was aware that this was happening. So these were like kind of two major spark points that were happening in 2018. Like there was just a lot of unrest in the company. So in November of that year, there was a massive employee action all around the world. And it still to date, people think of it as the largest labor action in tech because 20,000 employees walked out in protest of that payout of Andy Rubin. Like people really, really were upset. Everybody left their jobs for that day all around the world, actually. So you have people in the employee headquarters in San Francisco, but you also have people in like Zurich and Bangalore and all those offices who also felt really strongly. So it was kind of a moment of, I would say, like unprecedented global solidarity for like Google employees, where people really were like, no, we really do feel strongly as an entity that this is like not the company and culture and like program that we signed up to be working for. And everybody coordinated and everybody really like took a stand. People like spoke up, people like it was an employee strike for that day, essentially in protest of this sexual misconduct handling. And a lot of things kind of built from there. So, you know, I can't speak as much for like the Zurich or Bangalore office and stuff, but in the New York office, the team that organized the walkout for the New York office kind of continued to have meetings. So we would have like walkout lunches. So everybody who was kind of interested in the politics of that, believed in like standing up for what we believed in, we would have lunch every Thursday, kind of a standing meeting, and kind of continue the conversation. And that really grew from there because it changed from like, we were just talking about these sexual harassment cases to like, okay, how do we, as the people in this room, talk about the surveillance contracts or drone work that Google is doing? So it really like morphed from this like single event into like an opportunity for people who really wanted to be active in this conversation to connect and really like build our power in that way. And the aftermath of that in the next year is that 5 of my coworkers, so these were all folks in New York City, all folks that I know pretty well, and I was having lunch with them every Thursday after this giant walkout. 5 of them were all fired, basically unceremoniously by Google for like vague employee activism things. Like they had circulated a contract around not wanting Google to work with our, very violent immigration enforcement in the United States. And for that, the 5 of them were fired, and we had no real recourse in that. It really like caused a lot of fear. Nobody wanted to come to the meetings anymore. We just kind of like lost momentum around this, and it was really tough. Like we hadn't offered these 5 people any protections. Essentially, each of them individually was functioning as like a martyr to the movement, right? Like everybody individually takes this risk. Everybody can lose their job, their health insurance, their ability to support their family at any time. And that's like a really huge thing to ask of people. Like it's not everybody can be a whistleblower and like sacrifice their whole life for that. And it's not a sustainable way to do a movement, in my opinion. Like I think personally, I believe that like whistleblowers and like individual activists are really heroic and wonderful. But I also think that we can't build like a really deeply large and powerful movement if we rely on individuals to make like big sacrifices like that, and we're not acting as like an entity. So that was one of the major things that like sparked us wanting to start a union. And there was another very public firing of an AI ethicist, Dr. Gebru, who was publishing a paper about systemic racism in Google's AI algorithms. And she got fired for that because she was saying just really inconvenient truths that like the directors in her department didn't want to hear. And like 2,000 people signed letters in protest of this because it is pretty bonkers to hire someone who's really qualified to counsel and instruct and is like an academic in the field of ethical AI, and take what she is saying about ethical AI and fire her for it and not listen, right? Like that's a pretty like damning state of affairs for a company like Google. So we were starting to have these like activism moments and these kind of like blow-ups where like people were trying to do the right thing, and suddenly there was a lot more friction from the company. And when we were fighting a giant corporation as single individuals, everybody was just at massive risk. Like whether you're just a regular employee or whether you are a top leader in your field as an AI ethicist, like nobody felt safe in that moment. That's kind of how the culture is shifted. And for that reason, that was like kind of for all of these reasons, that there was all these issues that people really wanted to weigh in on, that we were not being listened to, that it wasn't safe to speak out on, but in a way that didn't sit right with us, right? Like, how do you clock into work every day and lose your right to say that like the AI that you're working on is unethical, or that the contract we're taking is going to cause, immeasurable harm? Like to silence people's dissent in that way is so, it's really disempowering. It's really frustrating. It's really horrific for like the state of the world when we're trusting these companies to steer us into that future. So all of these things kind of turned into this funnel moment of, I think we need to start a union. That became the conversation. We were like, that will allow us to pool our resources. We'll be able to, file lawsuits on each other's behalfs. We get legal rights. But yeah, we really wanted to organize at tech because it does just have all this power over our lives. And we also know how these like workplace issues and also the impact on people who use Google technology is not two separate things, right? Like if we're treating our workers a certain way, that's how users and the world are being treated. So I think there really was just this kind of sequence of feelings that we're responsible for this and we're not being given a seat at the table. So we need to like fortify our ability to be heard. And just kind of like rolling with that. So this was all, wow, almost 5 years ago now. Is when it really like began. And then we launched our union publicly in January 2020. So that's when, you know, we came out publicly and informed the world that we have like 1,000 people who've signed cards, who are Google employees, who are now formal members of this protected union. After doing 2 years of kind of like under the table work, trying to make sure that, you know, Google didn't know that we were doing all this stuff, that we were talking to our coworkers, but not so publicly that we would get while we were in a vulnerable time. But okay, so that took us from 2018 to 2020. And now I'm just going to kind of jump us forward into what is the union doing now? Like, why is this still relevant? What are the actions the union has taken? So earlier this year, so end of last year and early this year, as you guys are aware, the tech industry just massive layoffs all over. It was like 12,000 jobs at Google, half of Twitter's workforce, you know, 13% of Lyft and Facebook's workforce. Like it was just this really abrupt loss of employment and stability for the tens of thousands of people across the industry, just very abruptly out of nowhere. There were no other jobs to apply to. People were losing their visas. People were losing their healthcare. People like really was like a tough moment, I would say. And it continues to be like the tech industry is still in this weird moment, I would say. And the Google union, as well as other unions in tech, really kind of rallied around this. They started doing informational campaigns. They started, you know, protesting and you know, pooling resources for people who were laid off, who might need more support. They, you know, really spoke out on like how unethical and jarring it is to like basically wake up one day and your badge just doesn't work at the office, and that's how you find out that you're laid off, and now like you need to find a new financial resource, right? Like that is what happened, and it was really, I think, terrifying for a lot of people, and people didn't really know how to talk about it or what to do about it, because if you spoke about it, maybe you would be next, right? That's the threat that is hanging in the air to everybody. But the union is able to like have larger protections against that, because coming out as like a larger entity and saying that this is what the union thinks and this is what like people affiliated with the union think, it kind of makes it makes retaliation more obvious, if that makes sense. Like if Google is going to suddenly select out those employees and fire them all, we have legal recourse, because retaliating against people for union activity is more legally protected than just like firing an employee because they weren't a culture fit. Like the route of union protection is just a lot stronger. So folks use that for these rallies. They were really large, really like empowering. People who were laid off could come out and like kind of speak about the issue. Let's see. And the union did a mass recruitment campaign. So they made they put flyers on basically every single desk in the Boston and New York and San Francisco offices that were, you know, this letter. These recent January layoffs have left us feeling XYZ. The union is a vehicle for collective bargaining power, which gives us a say in layoff packages, things like that. And like, are you interested in joining it? And here's our next event, basically. So the union used this as like a moment to be like, hey, are you freaked out? We're pretty freaked out. Do you want to come to a union meeting? And you know, continue building our power, which has been really effective. The union has fought for, you know, data center workers in our South Carolina offices. It's fought for contractors in our Texas offices. It's fought for, like, the headquarters offices have people who work in the cafeteria and janitors there, and we fought for those people. The union has had these like consecutive wins over and over, fighting for people's union rights. And now in this moment of layoffs, it made like a lot of sense to kind of remind people of that, to say like, hey, this is like the only way to protect our jobs, whether we're a software engineer or a janitor at Google. Like we all deserve a say in, you know, in our employment, in our post-employment, in like the way we're treated at work and given security and like respect from our employer. So it's just kind of like a reflection activity. If you guys could just like, you know, pull out some kind of like notes app or like notes or anything, or maybe just share some thoughts on this in a discussion. What do you guys think are some of the strengths of the strategies that I just shared? And how do you think press or media might hurt or help union campaigns? I think, yeah, let's discuss those two questions. I want to be conscious of time. So maybe some strengths that you think of.
Yeah, I'm wondering, do we skip the writing part? If anyone wants to say something, then feel welcome to raise your hand. I have one quick question, Raksha, in between. So I have very little understanding of how unions work in the US. Why did you have to start your own union and not join one of the existing big labor unions that surely are around?
So we actually did join a larger union called the Communication Workers of America. They supported our union campaign and we became like a branch of their union. So they did all of our training and support at the beginning because we obviously didn't know how to do any of that. So they gave us kind of the union infrastructure, and now we pay dues and we help support, you know, other union campaigns around the country for people in other industries. We don't have like a guild yet, which is like kind of the ideal end destination, that like all tech workers would be in some kind of workers guild. We have a model for that in the US for actors and writers and other people in the arts, that it's like a trade guild. Like everybody who works in that industry is assigned union employee. So when they're hired onto projects or into any workplace, they have those protections. Ideally, we could get there with tech workers, but we're not really there yet. So right now we're still at the stage of making kind of these small branch organizations that are affiliated with larger unions that are just affiliated with individual workplaces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
From your side, any ideas and answers to Raksha's questions? Someone who wants to speak up? I think what you're experiencing here is that most of us are academics, and unionization in the academic sector is much less prevalent than in industry, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, but that's I don't know how it is in Europe personally, but unionization in academia is actually really growing in the US. A lot of graduate students are joining unions now for their labor rights. And some like faculty and staff are also doing that because, like, you know, tenure tracks and like academia labor rights can also be its own thing. But I don't know. I don't know the context of in the European context if that's also the same situation. But here we are having kind of a new and increased boom of graduate students and faculty unionizing. But that might not be true for you guys. So maybe this is not as relevant.
Yeah. No. Okay. I go to Iman first.
Yeah. I just
Wait.
I just wanted to add a bit of context. So over in the UK, there's actually a massive kind of movement towards unionizing within the universities, mainly due to mess ups within pensions and we don't quite have tenure tracks as you guys do in America, but based on seniority and internal like office politics, a union is seen as a way of sidestepping the traditional hierarchy that is in place with a university where it's very top down. And for that purpose, it's incredibly useful to be able to get your voice heard. But at the same time, it's harder to access as a postgraduate student. If you're not like employed by the university, which a lot of postgraduate students aren't, we have stipends, which are paid differently, so we don't pay taxes. It's very difficult to actually get your voice heard. So to phrase that as a question, what kind of advice would you give to a postgraduate student where the student unions are mostly focused on undergraduate and where the university unions are mostly focused on pure employees? What would you give to us to like help us get our voices heard? How should we structure? What should we go about doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because as you voiced, graduate students really are in the middle where universities aren't treating y'all like employees nor as students. It's kind of like you're both when it's convenient to the university, in my opinion, if that's not too like harsh to say. That's my kind of purview on the circumstance, which seems really deeply unfair and, you know, disempowering as a, you know, shaky ground place. I think the best way, and, you know, this is my union perspective in general, is kind of just like banding together as strongly as you can, right? Like talking to the other graduate students, realizing you're all in the same boat and like seeing what kind of momentum you can take out of that. I also, you know, encourage folks to talk to people outside of their own universities and see like how other people are doing it. It really is just like building this network and building this community, because it really, when you're working against these large institutions like universities or big companies, they are so organized, right? Like they have a vehicle, they have their press statements perfected, they have their like reasoning, they have their accountants, their budget folks, and then we're kind of all working as this like, you know, vehicle of individuals who aren't really talking to each other and working as a collaborative. But once you do have that, at the end of the day, these universities do need their graduate students. These wheels are not going to be turning. These professors are not going to be sufficiently supported. The undergraduates are not going to get the resources and mentorship that they need. Like these universities rely on their graduate students, right? And it's kind of a matter, in my opinion, of coordinated efforts. So that way nobody is ever going up against a university alone. I think it's starting to like have these meetings or like talk to each other. And it doesn't have to be a union meeting if that scares people. It can just be like a, you know, student body meeting or like town hall, or like just kind of casual conversations you have with your peers around like, these are not okay things. Like, what do you guys think we could do together? And like, then you suddenly have all these new powers in your hands, going on strike or going to the press and telling them that this is how they treat students. All these like new action plans for escalation become available to you. And you wouldn't necessarily do them. I'm not saying like you have to join together and then like go immediately to the press. But it at least gives you and your peers like this opportunity to talk about the circumstances, and that in itself can be really cathartic and powerful and empowering, and like kind of the ability to make your own choices democratically, I think is really the best advice that I can give, because at the end of the day, you're the best decision makers, but you should be talking to each other. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
for your talk so far. To answer part of your question, I think what was super nice was solidarity with all employers. So employees, so also cafeteria workers and people on short-term contracts, and collecting members in times of crisis. I think this is super strategic. I was wondering what you have to offer to your members, because in the Netherlands, unions are quite strong. And what we see is that the more traditional unions do things like collective labor agreements, individual legal support, lobby on policy.
Mhm.
Yet the newer unions, primarily in the gig economy, also do things like financial solidarity when somebody gets in an accident or gets fired. They do court cases, things like this. So they're have more solidarity and they have more radical actions at the same time. And I was wondering where in the spectrum the Alphabet Union also is and what you offer your members.
So it was a little bit of everything. During the layoffs period, people really did start crowdfunding resources and offering like actual financial support, you know, for like cafeteria workers or people who needed that kind of support. The other thing we did is we filed lawsuits on people's behalf. So the union has its own lawyer. So when people are facing like unlawful termination or workplace discrimination, we have collectively paid for a lawyer that we all pay our dues into and pay their salary, and they're like on retainer for us. So nobody individually has to hire their own lawyer, for example, which can be very expensive, especially when you're going up against Google. Like we now have professional labor union lawyers who are very capable and like experienced at going up against large entities like universities and corporations. So, you know, we offered people legal resources, we offer them financial resources, we offer like basically any kind of campaign and solidarity that they request. If they're like, I just want my job back, or like, you know, or I want, you know, compensation for discrimination, or I just, you know, want to tell my story. We really just like allow people to guide that decision and can offer a lot of different kinds of support like that. Let me see where my slides are going. Yeah, I feel like we've talked about all this, why it should be democratized, why we care about this kind of stuff.
One more question from the room, Raksha.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question about the quitting and leaving people, because some people would say to you, you don't agree with the Google project and Google policy on sexual harassment, for example. Why don't you quit your job? Some people will more aligned with this policy will do this job, actually there is movement of people that are leaving their meaningless job, and that communicate on that on the social media, and this is a tragedy. On the other hand, I think your action is really important, and I'm really interested in this action because company like Google is a really powerful and company that has that's a major player in today's policies, global policy, and we need to change it. But yes, I want to know your position on the fighting and leaving people.
Yeah, I think quitting and leaving in protest is like an absolutely good and valid choice. At the end of the day, you know, it's where I landed with Google. I spent 3 years doing this, and by the end I was extremely burnt out. Like I was working full days and then full nights on union campaigns. And I couldn't sustainably do that anymore and affect the change I wanted. However, I can off the top of my head think of 2 good reasons that people might choose to stay. One is that, you know, they might not have the same privilege that I do to leave. Like people have to stay at jobs for all kinds of reasons, right? And like you will always have a coworker who might need to stay at that job. So it's worth fighting for them for that. They might be on a visa that requires workplace sponsorship, or they might have high healthcare needs, and Google provides like the best insurance that they can get. You know, there are reasons that people stay at jobs, and they shouldn't have to suffer because the people who can leave. You know, like it's worthwhile fighting for those people who have to stay. And then the other issue, I think, in universities, corporations, these contexts or tech startups is like, it's kind of an ethical question of, well, if every person at Google who wants AI to be better leaves Google in protest, then Google is going to be making very evil AI. So it becomes kind of an ethical choice that falls on every person. Do I stay here and do I try to steer this ship in a direction that I believe is better for the world? Or do I at some point have to step back and like try to help from the outside? And I think that's something that everybody has to ask themselves at like, based on their own circumstances and context. But you know, I think of those as two reasons that people might choose to stay, essentially, if that answers the question.
Thank you, Raksha. Do you want to move on and we can chat later more?
Yeah, totally. I'll also leave a little bit more time at the end. But you know, I think I've like talked about all this essentially in the passing, just kind of how we used our legal rights. But at the same time, the union is more than just legal rights. It really is this like community of support, people who listen to each other, who like believe each other's stories. If somebody says they're experiencing workplace harassment and you go to HR and HR doesn't really believe you, you can talk to your buddies in the union and they can tell you how they experience things. One example I can think of is towards the end of my time at Google, I got pulled into an HR meeting. Like it was a meeting that they gave me no notice on. They put on my calendar as just like meet with HR. And that's how Google handles this. They don't give you advance notice. They don't whatever. And I had no idea what to do. I had no idea what my legal rights were. And then so I basically pinged the union chat and I asked like, oh my God, I have this meeting. What if I'm about to be fired? And people were like, well, here are some things you can do. You have the right to ask for an advocate to come into that meeting with you. We can send a union advocate with you to help you, you know, speak up for yourself and know your legal rights. They don't do something sketchy. And also you have the legal right to record your meeting because New York State has one-party consent recording rules. So that means I can record any conversation, essentially. So, you know, those were two pieces of information that I just didn't know until I talked to other people in the union. So in addition to the legal and financial and logistical support that we provide, it really was just like this community support that I think made a lot of difference when, you know, you're being pulled into an HR meeting or you think you're going to be fired or retaliated against for speaking up, or you're facing discrimination for being like, you know, a woman or an immigrant at work or taking maternity leave, whatever. Suddenly you can talk to people who may have experienced the same thing. I can go over this a little bit, but essentially some of these slides I pulled together around the training that we had gotten as a union ourselves on how to have these conversations. Like, how do you get somebody who's in a really anxious place about losing their job? How do you get them to take that risk of coming to a union meeting where they're like, no way, that's going to make me more likely to lose my job? How do you convince people that this is the way forward, that this is like what we do? And this is the kind of training that like aligning with a larger union or just other people who have unionized can provide for you. They have real like actual just like handbooks and break down things on like how do you listen correctly? How do you understand what your coworkers are struggling with? How do you help people recognize these fears, but also turn those fears into power instead of, you know, allowing these companies to divide and conquer us using these fear tactics? I wouldn't be able to run like a whole union training right now, but essentially when we aligned with a larger body and decided to go with this structure, we just had more tools at our disposal to have these conversations and like to do them correctly and like build empathy with our coworkers so that way we could actually do something about it. We really, you know, we go into these conversations around how do we tell people what might be happening? Because, you know, these companies spend millions on union busting, and it's no joke. Like, people do have a valid reason to be anxious. It's not like in people's imagination or something. Like, there's a reason. It's not that people aren't like brave enough or something to join the union. It's that like there are very real concerns and risks for doing so. So like, how do we still risk mitigate? How do we protect people who are more vulnerable? Like, how do we allow people to be a part of this work or receive protections in ways that are, you know, respectful of their context and able to like actually support them? So all of this stuff was kind of like things that we learned in the union process. Like, we genuinely studied. Like, we had all these trainings, we had all these meetings, and it was like, how do you talk to your coworkers and get them to join the cause? And we learned that, we shared that information, we put it into effect. Like, yeah, we just were so much more prepared to fight a multinational trillion-dollar company than we would have been if we were all doing it alone. Right? Like, we were able to practice these skills, to practice with each other, to like build power. Like, there was all this like soft power behind it that just made us like more able to stand up for ourselves, basically.
Raksha,
Mhm.
who facilitated those trainings? Did you get support from existing unions to come in and do those trainings, or how did you manage this?
Yeah, so we got training from existing unions. And, you know, essentially the trade-off was that they invested in us in the front end when we were like a disorganized group of people who had no idea what we were doing. They like brought us to a conference or did all these webinars or like helped us understand what it even meant to make like an organizing committee or understand our legal rights. Like, they gave us all these resources. And then now, like 5 years into the project, now part of our dues go back into that larger union to support other people starting unions in their workplace. So that's kind of the cycle of like union life in the US, at least. There are these large union bodies that support people in unionizing, and then you kind of pay back into them once you've had your union and once you like have been trained and received these resources after like 5 or 7 years. So like, that's why that's the investment trade-off for these large unions. And so they provided our full training and like taught us how to do this, which was really incredible. Yeah, any other kind of specific questions on stuff that I mentioned? Or I can...
Yeah, there are more questions in the room. Just 1 second. You're gonna come forward a bit. Yep.
Hello, Raksha. Thank you for this presentation, although I missed half of it, but still I have a question for you. So considering the dynamics in the United States, for example, in Texas, Greg Abbott, or in Florida, Ron DeSantis, in the red state, the laws are very loose when it comes to labor unions. There's a high threshold for them to go for any, for example, against the company. But when it comes to the blue state, it's very different. And even the Supreme Court is more towards the conservative 6-to-3 ratio. How would you think it will create a balance where the labor laws in the red states and the blue states, what can be done? And also, like, what do you have to say regarding that?
Yeah, so we have a massive push around unions in this country to unionize in the South because, like you said, it's very much we have state by state divide. Like in New York City, in Massachusetts, in California, these are states that do at least have some labor infrastructure. I would say overall in this country, we have terrible union protections. Like we do really function as a country that protects corporate rights before people rights. But you're right, in the state by state case, we have some states that are better circumstances for unionization. And essentially like it's pouring a ton of resources into these southern states. That's what's happening right now with these union campaigns where we're sending more people who can do the trainings down to them. We're sending down like we're funding lobbyists who are like doing more advocacy work in these southern states and like encouraging people to build this like grassroots power because that's where it comes from. Like, yes, you can say the whole state of Texas is red, but that doesn't mean that there isn't like a factory of workers somewhere in that state who like want things to be better for themselves. And then that one factory talks to the next factory, talks to the next factory. And then suddenly we have like a changed tide, right? Texas and North Carolina and these states and Florida are swing states now, which they never have been in the past. They've always been really conservative, but we really are building all this like momentum and power in those states. And it is starting like by investing in them, in my opinion. It is going into these small shops in the South where nobody has talked to them about unionizing, where like they don't believe that they even have legal rights because they don't in a lot of cases, and then like spending money or time or whatever it takes to like help empower the people who are there. I think it's a slow process, but like I don't think that we can like abandon people who are in just because they're in a red state or something, right? They like deserve this capacity and like our resources to lobby and advocate for them. So yeah, there is a big push to be like funneling union resources to these underserved regions, as you said.
Hi, thank you for your talk. If I understood well, at the beginning, you said that you talked to coworkers from 2018 to 2020, kind of under the table, without having your management or Google knowing that you are organizing. So my question is, given the surveillance capabilities of your former employer and the history of union busting in US, how did you manage to actually go under the table to get unnoticed by your employer to organize? Did you stop using Google software suite? Do you organize on Google Meet?
It was crazy. Avoiding the eye of Google from when you're at Google was so hard. Like we couldn't use any of our corporate chats to talk to our coworkers. But then also when we got off corporate chat, we were like, okay, don't give me your Gmail, give me something else. And it was really this whole process, but we used mailing lists that were different. We switched to like Proton Mail and Signal for most of our organizing. Then we started doing we made our union chat on Discord is where we migrated to. We just started enacting like what is pretty standard like activist tech security measures, things that people do in any kind of movement work when they're running, any kind of contentious activism where they're trying to avoid, whether it's the state or their employer or whatever. We just used best practices and got off of all Google technologies to the best of our ability. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another intervention. We give you some time to finish this, but there's one more person wanting to say something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I wanted to know, now that the union is implemented since almost 3 years, what was kind of the reaction of Google direction to the union existence? Is it more like, well, taking into preemptive actions to try to cope with union opinions and stuff like that, or are they just doing or keeping business as usual and then see where the union will be a pain in the ass?
Yeah, I think Google's first response, and primarily their public response, has been like a non-engagement policy. I think they've really taken this stance of like, oh, the union, it's just like a few people who are like, you know, radicals, like we don't even acknowledge that. Whatever. That's kind of been their stance. Like they're like, oh, like, you know, we just want to talk to our employees one-on-one. We don't know why they unionize. Like it's this very like deny the circumstance approach, but at the same time, we've watched them suddenly start spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on hiring very successful and famous union busting lawyers and consultants. So it's clear that they are reacting to it. And then they've changed a lot of internal policies as well. For example, there are internal mailing lists and everybody used to have access to them, but at some point they banned all contractors. So nobody who's not a full-time employee suddenly was banned from these internal mailing lists, which was a huge policy change because before the contractors could just talk to the employees and have this open conversation. Suddenly Google changed that policy. But you know, if you ask them, they're like, no, it has nothing to do with the union. We don't know what you're talking about. No idea. But you know, all these actions do not indicate that that's true, in my opinion.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, the rest of my material is not so union related. I didn't really know how many questions there would be, so I had like excess material, but you know, some of my continued work is around like other worker advocacy. So Twitter fired every single one of their janitors in their city offices, and I did interviews and published their stories, and I did Spanish to English translations for the Tech Workers Coalition so that people could hear from these workers. Our gig workers in New York City are getting more rights. We just last month, like 3 weeks ago, celebrated a massive victory that we have set a new minimum wage for these gig drivers, which is a campaign we've been fighting for a long time. Other campaigns that I work on is I work with sex workers around how they are discriminated against on platforms like Instagram, and payment platforms like PayPal. And this is like part of a larger campaign of, you know, kind of like democratizing and decarcerating and like fighting for people's digital rights. This is like an oversight of NYPD Surveillance Technology Act that I've also worked on. So, you know, just kind of like a range of things that I've been doing after Google. I currently work for Planned Parenthood, which is like a large, I mean, it's our big like abortion provider here, but it's like a healthcare provider. So yeah, I left my software engineering life to kind of be a full-time activist. And now I do like tech activism and general like community activism because, like I said, when I was working 2 full-time jobs, was a software engineer by day and then a union organizer by night, and I realized I can't work 80-hour weeks. I picked the union organizer route. I decided that was the job I wanted. I didn't want to be a software engineer anymore. So that's the route that my life has taken in the last 2 years. I left Google 2 years ago, almost exactly like June 2021. And yeah, this is what I've been up to. Sorry, I've run us so close to time, but
oh, so time. We still have a few minutes left. But it's interesting that these questions around being overworked and burning out when you engage in activism and your work, they came up before, and it's interesting that it seems to be a common theme that we need to somehow address. Thank you very much, Raksha, for your talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone has any questions or wants to connect, that's my website, and you can get my like LinkedIn or email address and other stuff there. And I'm fully happy to like ever, you know, hop on a phone or talk about these things further about union organizing at universities or like questions about this topic. So yeah, just wanted to give that as a resource to all of you.
Questions from the room? We have like a few minutes left if someone wants to say something. We have plenty of interactions in between, but if there's something open, then come on, Iman.
No, I didn't have a question. I was just going to ask if she was in the Parameter teams.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so we have like a kind of formal / informal community on something called Parameter teams on Mattermost, which is not owned by Google. Brilliant. I was wondering if you'd like to join, just if there's any questions that filter in through the day as our thoughts coalesce together. I myself, it takes like a few minutes for me to figure out what's going on, and then I can ask a question. But yeah, really appreciate having you there if that's all right. Would that be something you're open to?
Yeah, totally. That sounds great.
We'll have the link sent over to you, and it'll be really cool to see some of the questions ongoing and discussions to keep going through that. And I might need your help with organizing a little bit of a union.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love all of this. Let's absolutely stay in touch. Cool.
It's another chat platform. Don't burn out.
I'm on every chat platform. It is how it is. That is the organizer life.
Okay, people, I think it's about time for lunch. Thank you very much, Raksha, for being with us, for sharing your thoughts, and yeah, we chat in the next couple of days.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Bye.